In October of 1891, a man named Harlan Sizemore rode up a ridge in Bell County, Kentucky, to collect a debt and found the Claypool cabin boarded shut from the inside. He called out for 20 minutes and got no answer. When he broke through the north shutter and climbed in, the table was set for 7, supper still on the plates, every door nailed, every window sealed. Outside, 3 days of rain had turned the ground to black mud, and in that mud there was not a single footprint leading away from the cabin. The Claypools were gone, all 7 of them, and the mountain has not given them back since. The hollow where the Claypools live doesn't appear on most maps of Bell County, and it never did. It sits in the crook of 2 ridges, about 11 miles northeast of Cumberland Gap, where the terrain folds in on itself so tightly that the sun clears the eastern ridge around 10 in the morning and disappears behind the western 1 by 3 in the afternoon. The creek that runs through the bottom is cold and fast, even in August, fed by springs that push up through the limestone and carry the particular mineral taste of water that has been moving through rock for 1,000 years before it sees daylight. The coal seam beneath that ridge is one of the richest in the Cumberland Gap field. It runs in a long black arc through Bell and Harlan counties, the same seam that made fortunes for men in Louisville and New York and Philadelphia, who never once stood at the mouth of a mine, never went down, never felt the mountain pressing on them from above. The seam under the Claypool Ridge was thick, nearly smokeless, and had been partially worked in the early 1882 before a collapse in 1883 killed 2 men and the company abandoned the shaft. The abandoned entrance sat at the base of the ridge like a mouth that had stopped talking. The company had not properly sealed it. They had driven a horizontal shaft into the hillside, hit the seam, pulled what they could, and when the ceiling came down on those 2 men, they simply walked away and left the hole as it was. Over the years, the timbers rotted and the mouth narrowed, but it never closed. Cold air breathed out of it in every season, and in winter the breath rose in pale columns that the children in the hollow called the mountain smoking. Enoch Claypool built his cabin on a shelf of flat ground halfway up the ridge, above the flood line and below the timber line, in the late 1862, before the coal companies came, before the railroad, before any of it. He chose that spot for a simple reason. It was the only patch of level ground wide enough to set a foundation without cutting into the hillside, and it had a clear sight line down the hollow, to the creek and up to the ridge above. Enoch was a man who liked to see what was coming before it arrived, and from that cabin he could see the entire hollow, the old mine entrance, and the single track that connected his family to the world below. The isolation was not a drawback for the Claypools, it was the point. The nearest neighbor was 40 minutes by foot along a track that turned to creek bed in rain, and the nearest company store was a full day's walk down the ridge to the rail camp at Pineville. In winter, the hollow could be cut off for days at a time when the creeks flooded and the track iced over. Frost could occur in any month of the year in those valleys which record some of the lowest temperatures in the eastern United States outside the summit stations in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. Snow has fallen in every month except July. The mountain did not care who lived on it. The mountain was there before any of them, and it would be there after. The hollow produced the Claypools as surely as it produced the coal. You can't understand what happened to them without knowing who they were, and who they were was inseparable from the place they lived. 7 people lived in that cabin by the autumn of 1891, and each of them deserves a name before we go any further, because the county record that followed their disappearance reduced them to a list of ages and genders, and that is not how they lived. Enoch Claypool was 62, the patriarch, the one who had built the cabin with his own hands, from chestnut logs he felled on the ridge, and he had walked those mountains since before the coal companies came, and before the railroad opened the seams to men who had never seen them. Enoch knew the hollow the way a sailor knows water, not from studying it, but from being on it long enough that the rhythms become part of your blood. He had found things in the old mine shafts after the company left, things he never spoke about to anyone outside the family, and the silence he kept about those findings was the kind of silence that holds more than it hides. His wife Marguerite was 57, and she was the one who kept the family from spinning apart during the hard months when the creek flooded and the coal was thin and the winter settled into the hollow like a guest who wouldn't leave. She kept the garden, preserved what she could, cooked on the same iron stove for 30 years, and she could read, which was unusual for a woman in that hollow in that era. And she taught the children their letters by candlelight in the evening when the work was done. Their son Amos was 34, the one who worked the seam. Amos mined independently, pulling small loads from a drift he had carved himself on the far side of the ridge, selling what he could to the railroad men who came through on the supply wagons. He didn't work for the company, didn't take scrip, didn't shop at the company's store. This independence made him respected in the hollow, and made him a problem to the men who were trying to buy up every ridge and every name in Bell County. Amos's wife, Delia, was 29, and she held things together when they frayed, which was often. Delia had come from Pikeville as a bride of 16, and the hollow had been a shock to her, the closeness of the ridges, the darkness that came early, the silence that was not empty but full of sounds she couldn't identify. She had adapted the way people adapt to places that don't care whether they survive, by becoming harder than the conditions around her. Their 3 children were Whit, who was 11 and who already knew how to set a charge and read a seam, C, who was 8 and who followed her grandmother everywhere and learned the garden and the preserving and the reading, and the youngest, a boy named Jessam, who was 4 and who hadn't yet spoken a full sentence. Delia said he was listening to something the rest of them couldn't hear. There is one more detail, and it matters. Enoch had carved symbols into the oak door frame of the cabin when he built it, not crosses, not letters. Not any mark that anyone in the family could explain, or that anyone outside the family ever saw. Marguerite said they were protective, the way her grandmother had protected the houses in the old country. Amos said they were just marks, the way his father marked everything he built. Enoch said nothing about them at all, and the silence he kept was the same silence he kept about the things he had found in the old shaft. Their independence made the Claypools stand out in that hollow. It also made them visible to men who had already bought everything else. The company was called Continental Coal and Iron, and it was headquartered in Louisville, and it did not ask. It offered terms, and the terms were always the same, and the terms were not negotiable. And everyone in Bell County knew this by the spring of 1891, whether they had signed those terms or not. Continental had operations across Bell and Harlan counties, mines and camps and company stores and company houses, and the scrip that functioned as money in those hollows when real money was scarce. An estimated 75% of all scrip in the United States was issued by coal companies in Kentucky, Virginia, and West Virginia, and Continental was one of the largest issuers. The scrip came in brass or nickel tokens embossed with the company name and the words non-transferable, and it could only be spent at the company store, which was always the largest building in the camp, brick and mortar, fully stocked, the only place to buy flour and coffee and the pickaxes and blasting powder the miners needed underground. The company store was where you spent your scrip, and it was where you went deeper into debt. because the wages paid in scrip never covered the prices the company charged, and the advances the company offered on future wages paid out at 50 to 80 cents on the dollar, which meant that every miner in those camps was perpetually behind. Earning credit against money he had not yet made to buy goods at prices he couldn't afford from a store he couldn't leave. Every other family in that hollow was on scrip. Every other family owed their house, their food, their tools, their children's shoes to Continental Coal and Iron. The Italian and Hungarian immigrants who had come through Ellis Island and been recruited by company agents and put on trains to the coal fields found themselves in remote mountain towns with debt they could never repay and no way to get back. Their consulates had demanded investigations in the 1,890 seconds, and the investigations produced nothing, and the debt continued. Amos sold his coal for cash, and Delia bought her flour and coffee from a general store in Pineville, a full day's walk, because she wouldn't set foot in the company store, and she wouldn't take scrip, and she wouldn't owe Continental Coal and Iron a single brass token, and this stubbornness wasn't pride, it was survival. And it was the reason the Claypool name still meant something when every other name in that hollow had been reduced to a ledger entry and a debt column. Their freedom was a single cabin on unstable ground, above a seam the company was about to blast open, and the mountain itself was being used as a weapon against them. In the spring of 1891, Continental announced the reopening of the old shaft on Claypool Ridge, the one that had collapsed in 1883 and killed those two men. New timbering techniques, they said. Safer now, they said. What they meant was that the seam beneath the Claypool cabin was the thickest untapped vein in the county, and the only way to reach it was through their land, and they intended to reach it regardless of whether the Claypools agreed. A company man named Rourke visited the cabin 3 times. The first time he offered to buy the ridge plot and the cabin, and Amos refused, and the second time he offered scrip credit and a company house in the camp below the ridge, and Enoch refused, and the third time Rourke didn't make an offer at all. He stood on the porch and told them the mine would open regardless of their consent. The blasting would begin in October. The ridge would shake. A cabin built on a shelf of ground above a seam that was about to be carved open might not hold, and Continental couldn't be held responsible for what the mountain did to structures built on land the company didn't own. The Claypools were the only free family on that ridge, and their freedom was a single cabin on unstable ground above a seam the company was about to blast open, and the mountain itself was being used as a weapon against them. The blasting started on schedule. The 3rd of October, 1891, 2 shifts, 6 days a week, and the ridge shook every morning at dawn and every evening at dusk, with a deep, percussive thump that traveled through the limestone and came up through the floorboards of the Claypool cabin and rattled the cups on the shelf above the iron stove. After the first week, things that had no business happening in October began to happen. In that hollow, the creek ran muddy and warm, which it never did after the first frost. The water that had always been cold and clear and mineral tasting came out the color of rust, and it was warm to the touch. Not warm like a summer afternoon, but warm like something below the ground was heating it from underneath. And the smell that came off the water was not the limestone smell the family knew, but something older and heavier, like the air at the bottom of a mine shaft that has not been ventilated in years. The birds left the ridge on the 8th of October, not gradually, not a few at a time over a week. They were there in the morning, the crows and jays and the red-headed woodpeckers that nested in the chestnut below the cabin, and by noon they were gone, and the trees were silent, and the silence was not the silence of an empty forest, but the silence of a forest that had been emptied, as if something had told every living thing with wings to leave, and every one of them had listened, Amos came home from his independent drift on the 9th of October and told Delia that the air in the lower workings had changed. It tasted different, he said. It carried a smell he couldn't name, but that reminded him of something his father had once described to him when he was a boy, a smell Enoch had encountered in the old company shafts after the collapse, a smell that came from below the coal seam, from whatever was under the rock that the seam was resting on. Amos wouldn't say what his father had told him about that smell. He just said the air was wrong, and he wasn't going back into the lower drift. Enoch's reaction was the part that stayed with Delia. The old man did not seem surprised. He went to the door frame and touched the carved symbols, and he stood there with his fingers on the oak for a long time. And then he told Amos to stop going into the independent drift altogether, not just the lower part, the whole thing. When Amos asked why, Enoch said, "Because the mountain is open now, and what lives in the seams is not what the company is looking for." The neighbor, Harlan Sizemore, who lived a quarter-mile down the ridge in a cabin that was smaller and rougher than the Claypool place, reported hearing sounds from the Claypool cabin at night during the second week of October. Not voices, not movement. A low, rhythmic sound, like something breathing, a sound that came from the ground beneath the cabin and not from inside it, and Sizemore assumed it was the mine ventilation shafting pushing air through the old tunnels, and it was not the mine ventilation, because the ventilation in that old shaft had been shut down when the company left in 1883 and had not been restarted yet. The company did not care about warm creeks or silent birds or sounds in the ground. They cared about tonnage, and the blasting continued, and whatever was waking up beneath that ridge had no concern for the men above it who were arguing over deeds and borders and the price of coal, because the thing beneath the seam had been there longer than any of those arguments, and it was closer to the surface now than it had been in 100 years. And the only family standing between it and the open air was the one living in the cabin above the old shaft. Amos Claypool was not a man who backed away from a fight, and in October of 1891 he rode down the ridge to the county seat in Pineville and filed a formal complaint against Continental Coal and Iron, claiming the blasting was damaging his property and threatening his family's safety. The complaint was recorded on the 12th of October, 6 pages long, in a careful hand that his mother had taught him, and it was the longest complaint filed in that county that year. Nothing happened. No hearing was scheduled, no inspector was sent, because the county officials in Pineville understood the way county officials in coal counties always understand, that the side you take is the side that pays the taxes and builds the roads and employs the men who vote. The company's response wasn't legal, it was practical. They let the blasting debris do the talking. The rock and shale from the new shaft had dammed the narrow channel of the creek that ran past the Claypool cabin, and the water began to pool, turning the ground around the cabin into a bog of black mud that smelled of crushed shale, and something underneath, the same smell Amos had noticed in the drift, the smell from below the seam. Enoch spent the days after the complaint sitting in the cabin, staring at the symbols on the doorframe, and he talked more than he had in years, but not to anyone in the room. Marguerite said he was talking to his father, who had been dead for 23 years. Enoch said his father had warned him about this, that the mountain had taken people before, not in the way mines take them with cave-ins and gas, but in a different way. A way that left nothing behind, and the old mine was not abandoned because of the collapse. It was abandoned because of what the collapse revealed, and what it revealed was the reason those symbols were carved into the doorframe, and the reason the symbols were not crosses and not letters was that the thing they protected against was older than either. Delia wanted to leave. Amos wouldn't. The cabin was their land, the deed was in the Claypool name, and if they left, the company would take everything, and the name would disappear into the scrip economy like every other name in that hollow. The children were changing in ways Delia couldn't explain. Whit woke up screaming from something he said he could hear under the floor, a sound like breathing, but bigger, slower, the way a mountain would breathe if a mountain breathed. Cadi stopped talking for 3 days and then started again. And Jessam, who had never spoken a sentence in his 4 years, began to hum, a single note, low and steady, as if it came from somewhere deeper than his throat, and Delia said it sounded like something the mountain was teaching him. The family was under siege from 2 directions now, the company above and the mountain below, and the ground between them was turning to black mud, and Enoch was talking to his dead father, and Jessam was humming a note that no one had taught him, and the choice was narrowing to a single point, and that point was the night of the 17th of October. On the night of the 17th of October, 1891, the Claypools stopped trying to leave. They sealed themselves in. The details of that night come from 2 sources. The first is Harlan Sizemore's account, given to the Bell County Sheriff on the 21st of October. The second is a fragment of a letter, never mailed, written by Delia Claypool to her sister in Pikeville, found inside the cabin on the kitchen table next to one of the 7 plates. Sizemore saw lights in every window of the Claypool cabin around 9 that evening. The family used 2 tallow candles at night, and the windows were normally dim. That night, every window glowed with a steady yellow light that did not flicker the way candlelight flickers, as if the cabin itself was producing it. He heard the breathing sound again, louder and closer now, coming from the ground beneath the cabin, and he described it in his statement as the mountain having a dream, a phrase that has stayed with anyone who has read that statement in the 135 years since it was filed. Delia's letter is shorter and more immediate, and it's the only document that tells us what was happening inside the cabin that night. She wrote in pencil on a sheet of brown wrapping paper, the kind the general store in Pineville used for flour, and the handwriting is steady at the top and becomes uneven toward the bottom, and the final lines are barely legible. Enoch said, "We mustn't go out," she wrote. He said, "The mountain is open now, and what lives in the seams isn't what the company is looking for." He said they carved too deep and found the part of the mountain that was never meant to be disturbed. He's nailing the shutters. Amos is helping him. I'm holding Jessam. He's still humming. Marguerite is setting the table. She says we should eat. She says whatever is happening, we should have supper first. The barricading was Enoch's doing. He and Amos nailed the shutters from the inside, driving 6-penny nails through the oak into the frames with the same hammer Enoch had used to build the cabin 23 years earlier. They pushed the heavy oak table against the front door and wedged chairs under the window frames and checked every seal twice. Marguerite set the table while they worked, 7 plates, 7 cups, 7 forks, as if the act of preparing a meal was the only thing left that made sense, and Delia held Jessam, and Jessam hummed, and the sound from beneath the cabin grew louder and slower and closer, and the cabin was sealed as tight as a coffin, and nobody came, and nobody went. And the night passed, and when morning came, the cabin was still sealed and still lit and still breathing. For 2 days nobody went up the ridge. The track was flooded, and the mud was ankle deep, and the sound from the ground had not stopped, and the people in the hollow below told each other it was the mine, the new shaft, the ventilation, the blasting, and they told each other these things because the alternative was to listen to what the sound actually was, which was not mechanical and not geological and not anything they had a word for. On the third day, Harlan Sizemore went up anyway, because Amos Claypool owed him $4 for a crosscut saw blade, and Sizemore was the kind of man who would ride through black mud to collect a debt. And it's a strange thing that a debt is what brought the first witness to that cabin, but that is what happened. The 20th of October, 1891. Harlan Sizemore rode up the ridge on a gray mare through mud that pulled at the horse's legs and a cold fog that clung to the trees and the creek and the ground like something that did not want to let go. When he reached the cabin, it was still sealed. No sound from inside, no light through the shutters. The candles had burned out. He called out. 20 minutes of calling by his own count, shouting Amos's name and Enoch's name and Delia's name, into the silence of a cabin that shouldn't have been silent because 7 people had been inside it, and he got no answer. And the silence wasn't the silence of an empty house, but the silence of a house that had been emptied, which is a different thing. Because an empty house has never been full, and a house that has been emptied still holds the shape of the people who were there, and this cabin held that shape in the absence of everything else. He broke the shutter on the north window, the one that faced the ridge, and the wood splintered easily because the nails had been driven from the inside, and the frame gave way when he pulled, and he climbed through into the kitchen, and the air inside was close and stale, and carried a smell Sizemore couldn't place. Not rot and not sickness, but something mineral and old, the same smell Amos had reported in the lower drift. The same smell the creek water had carried, and it was stronger inside the cabin than it had been anywhere outside, as if the source of it was directly below the floor. The cabin was intact, nothing broken, nothing overturned. The barricades were still in place, the shutters nailed, the table pushed against the front door, the chairs wedged under the windows. Someone had moved the table slightly away from the door, Sizemore noticed, as if they had considered leaving and then changed their mind, but the barricade was still functional, and the door was still blocked, and the shutters were still sealed, and the cabin was still locked from the inside, as tight as it had been on the night of the 17th. But there were no people, and 7 people had been in that cabin, and none of them were there now, and there were no bodies, and no blood, and no sign of struggle, and no bags packed, and no coats missing from the hooks by the door, and no boots gone from the mat. The cabin had been sealed from the inside, and the people inside it had simply ceased to be inside it, and there was no explanation for this that Sizemore could find, and he searched every room and every corner and the loft above and the root cellar below, and the root cellar was the worst part because the root cellar was where the smell was strongest, and the floor of the root cellar was dirt, and the dirt was warm to the touch, which root cellar floors are never, ever warm. They're cool and damp and constant, and this one was warm the way the creek water had been warm, as if something below it was producing heat. Before Sizemore went to the sheriff, he noticed one more thing: the table. The table was set for 7. 7 plates, 7 cups, 7 forks, 7 chairs positioned as if the family had just sat down and the food was still on the plates. Cornbread on a shared plate in the center, stale but not moldy, which meant it had been sitting for 2 days in an unheated cabin in October, and the timing matches. A pot of beans on the stove, congealed, the fat risen into a white film. Salt pork in a skillet, dry and hard. Someone had prepared supper on the evening of the 17th of October, and that someone was Marguerite, because Marguerite always set the table and Marguerite always cooked, and Delia's letter confirms it. The detail that stopped Sizemore, the detail he recorded in his statement, and that has stayed with this story, is that each plate had been eaten from. Not much. A few bites of cornbread, a spoonful of beans, a piece of salt pork, torn but not finished. But every person at that table had taken food. and at some point between the first bite and the third, every single one of them stopped eating at the same time, as if something had interrupted them all at once and made 7 people put down their forks simultaneously. The cups held creek water, not spring water. You could tell by the fine black silt settled at the bottom, the same silt turning the ground outside into mud. Someone had gone outside to fetch water after the barricading began, or had opened the door briefly and then sealed it again, which means the sealing of the cabin was not complete when Marguerite set the table, or one of the 7 chose to unseal it just long enough to bring water in. 7 candles had burned down to stubs. The family ate by candlelight, and the light went out sometime during the night when nobody was left to relight them. The wax pooled between the plates in a way that told Sizemore the candles burned roughly 6 to 8 hours, putting the end of the family's presence somewhere between 3 and 5 in the morning. In the loft, Sizemore found Jessom's blanket, the one Delia had been holding when she wrote the letter. It was arranged in a shape, not folded, but arranged, as if someone had wrapped a child in it, and then the child as if the child had simply dissolved out of it, and the blanket held the shape of a boy who was no longer there, and it smelled of the same mineral smell that filled the cabin, stronger than anywhere else. As if whatever had taken the boy had passed through the blanket on its way out. Sizemore reported everything to the county sheriff, and the sheriff sent 3 men up the ridge, and they found what Sizemore found, and one thing he had missed, and that one thing is the detail that turns this from a strange story into something the county record couldn't contain. It had rained for 3 days before the 17th of October, and the ground around the cabin was ankle-deep black mud that held the print of every foot that touched it. Sizemore's own footprints from his walk up the ridge were clearly visible, and the sheriff's men left prints that were equally sharp, and every person who approached the cabin after the disappearance left a record of their arrival in the mud. But there were no prints leading away from the cabin in any direction, not toward the ridge trail, not toward the creek, not toward the mine entrance, not toward Sizemore's place. The mud recorded every approach after the fact and recorded nothing from the night of the 17th of October or the morning after, and 7 people had been inside that cabin, and not one of them left a mark when they left, because there was no physical way for 7 people to exit a sealed cabin and walk through ankle-deep mud without leaving a single footprint. And that is the fact the investigation couldn't explain and never has. The front door was barricaded with the heavy oak table and 3 chairs, still pushed against it from inside, still latched. The back door, which led to the root cellar and the slope behind, was nailed shut with 6-penny nails, driven from the inside, the same nails used on the shutters, and there was no way to remove them from outside without breaking the door, and the door was not broken. The windows were shuttered and nailed, and the chimney was too narrow for a child to pass through, let alone an adult, and it was intact, and there was no other exit. The cabin was a sealed container, and the people inside it had vanished, and the mud held no evidence they had ever opened a door or set foot on the ground after the night of the 17th. The company mine entrance 200 yards down the ridge showed no footprints either. The wooden gate was still padlocked, and the lock was not disturbed. The sheriff's conclusion, written in the county record on the 25th of October, reads, "The Claypool family departed by means unknown. No evidence of foul play, no evidence of flight, no evidence of anything." That last sentence has stayed with this story because it isn't a conclusion, it's an admission of the absence of one, and it's the only honest thing the county record has to say about 7 people who vanished from a sealed cabin on a ridge in Bell County. The county closed the file, the company sealed the mine, and the hollow went quiet. But the quiet was not empty, because whatever had been disturbed beneath that ridge was still there. And the story of what followed would have stayed buried in a county ledger if not for one more document that surfaced 128 years later. Continental Coal and Iron sealed the mine entrance with concrete on a Sunday in late October when the county office was closed. They brought in a crew from Harlan County who didn't know the Claypools, and these men poured concrete into the horizontal shaft and packed it tight and left. The work order was filed 3 weeks later, backdated to the 15th of October, 2 days before the Claypools sealed their cabin, which meant the official record showed the mine was already closed when the family disappeared, absolving Continental of responsibility for anything that came out of a shaft that no longer existed. The cabin sat sealed and empty through the winter. The county posted a deputy for 2 weeks, then pulled him because nobody would stand at the base of that ridge after dark. The snow came and covered everything, and when the spring thaw came, the mud was still there and still held no footprints, and the 7 plates were still on the table. And the people in the hollow below avoided the ridge the way you avoid a place where someone has been and is not anymore, because death you can understand and absence you can't. Harlan Sizemore never collected his $4. He moved his family to Pineville in the spring of 1892 and never went back, and in a letter to his brother he wrote, "I do not know what took them. I know that it did not come through the door. I know that it did not need to." That sentence is the closest thing to an explanation that anyone who was there ever offered, and it isn't an explanation at all. It's the shape of an absence. One of the miners from the reopened shaft, a man named Teague, was found sitting at the base of the sealed mine entrance on the 3rd of December, staring at the concrete. He had been there for 6 hours in the cold, and wouldn't say why. He spent the rest of his life in Pineville working at the livery stable and never entered a mine again. The Claypool name appeared one last time in the county records. A deed transfer, dated January 1892, signed by a Continental representative, transferring the ridge plot to the company for $1. No Claypool signed it, because no Claypool was alive to sign it. The notary did not question this. In Bell County in 1892, companies did not need signatures from the disappeared, and the land that Enoch had built on and carved symbols into the doorframe to protect passed into the ownership of the company that had driven the shaft beneath it and sealed the evidence in concrete. The story would have ended there, in that ledger, if not for one more document. In 2019, a labor historian named Dr. Caroline Hensley was cataloging the Continental Coal and Iron archives at the Kentucky Coal Museum in Benham. The archives had been donated after the company's bankruptcy in 1994 and sat in cardboard boxes for 25 years while the staff cataloged the photographs and script collections, the things people come to see, because a box labeled Routine Operational Correspondence 1889 to 1893. She opened the box on a Tuesday afternoon in March and found a crew manifest for the shaft reopening project, dated September 1891, and it was routine and boring, and she almost filed it back without turning it over. On the back of the manifest, in pencil, someone had written a note in small, hurried handwriting that leaned to the right, and it read, "The old man knew. He told us not to go past the second crosscut. He said what's down there has been down there longer than the mountain. We went past the second crosscut on the 14th of October. The drilling hit something that was not rock. It was not coal. It was warm. It moved. We have not told the superintendent." The note was undated and unsigned and had been folded into the manifest, as if someone meant to throw it away and forgot, or meant to keep it and then decided it was too dangerous to keep and too dangerous to destroy, and so left it inside a boring document that nobody would ever read, and it sat in that box for 128 years. Dr. Hensley photocopied the note and filed it with her personal research. She did not publish it when a colleague asked her why, she said, "I don't know what it means, but I know what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean the Claypools were taken by a cave-in, or by the company, or by each other. Whatever took them was already in that mountain before any of us were here. The note doesn't explain what happened, it explains why." Men drilled past the second crosscut on the 14th of October, and they hit something that wasn't rock and wasn't coal, something warm that moved. And 3 days later, the family above that shaft sealed themselves inside their cabin and vanished from a room where the plates still held food and the blankets still held the shape of a child who was no longer there. The mountain kept what it took. The company sealed what it found. The Claypools disappeared because something beneath the seams, something older than the mountain itself, was disturbed by drilling that went too deep, and the family closest to it was collected, and the mountain simply took them back into the silence it had always kept. The cabin, if it still stands, sits at the end of a ridge that nobody walks anymore. The concrete seal on the mine entrance is covered in moss now. The hollow is quiet. The creek still runs cold. And beneath the concrete, beneath the seams, beneath the mountain itself, whatever has been down there longer than the mountain is still there. The Claypools are not subscribed to the buried registry. We have more stories that the ground tried to keep.